we're facing a situation today where there are going to be more plastics in the ocean by the year 2050 than there are fish.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Kristoff, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode, I was going to continue a trend of not talking about stuff that I normally talk about, being forestry, land management, that sort of thing. I don't know why I'm on that trend, but that's the trend I'm on. So let's keep that train going a little bit longer. And so I took this opportunity to speak to a gentleman named Raz Razgaitis. Now, Raz is a CEO and founder of a company called FloWater. So FloWater is a company that's on a mission to provide the purest, most premium water on the planet while eliminating plastic water bottle waste. That's what got me, the plastic water bottle waste. It's an issue that I'm completely uneducated in. I have no contacts in that world. So this was a great opportunity to speak to somebody in that sphere. And Raz is that person. He's got a really good understanding of the issues around plastic water bottle waste, right? Why aren't people recycling? Why is this ending up in the dump or in the ocean or in our parks? Why is this not going sustainably the way we want it to go? It's a real problem that needs a solution. And Raz's company, FloWater, has a really interesting solution, which is just getting people to fall in love with tap water again. Just refiltering it and making it taste good, making it good for you, and not having the waste, right? So having a sustainable water source that's in the developed world is just 20 feet away from you, right? Something that you love. And so I really enjoyed our conversation because I got to get a little bit of an insight onto Raz on his motivations, why he does this work. His driver, his purpose kind of for doing this work. And I think that the business world has a huge opportunity when it comes to solving the world's problems and making the world a better place. And FloWater seems like one of those companies that's doing something great and can fix one of the problems that we've got ourselves into, right? So yeah, we're talking all about plastic water bottle waste, how that's getting into our bodies and becoming a health problem, and how FloWater can solve that, help solve for that issue, right? And so, it was a lot about things that I'm completely unaware of that I'm sure you're interested in. So environmental issues, health issues, that kind of stuff. You're going to love it. Raz is a really insightful person who spent the time to get familiar with the ins and outs of the plastic recycling and pollution part of the industry. And I just love talking to him. It was a lot of fun and I learned a bunch. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2021. Without them, I could not make this happen. I thank them infinitely for all of their help. It has made me able to do this podcast the way I want. So thank you, West Fraser. Greenlink Forestry is a secondary sponsor. They've been with me since the beginning, and I could not be more thankful for their help as well. Thank you, Greenlink. And Damaged Timber is a local company out of Edmonton, Alberta, and they are selling their main staple product is damaged timber that you can put in your kitchen. So it's really cool. They go out into wildfire burn areas, bring that wood in and turn it into butcher blocks and that kind of thing that you can put in your kitchen. It's awesome. Your Forest 10 at checkout on their website. Their website is damagedtimber.com. Check them out. You can get 10% off with that code Your Forest 10 at checkout. So, without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation with Raz. It was a lot of fun. So I hope you guys like it. I learned a lot. Here we go. I want to start just getting to know you a little bit and just what motivates you to get out of bed in the morning? You know, like what is your driving factor that gets you out of bed and kind of just makes you want to make the world a better place, you know?
Well, you know, that's interesting. I actually have, over the last week, had this motivation discussion with one of my daughters. I've got two daughters. One is 17 and the other is turning 19 on Saturday. And so, we've actually have been having this conversation. I'm going to answer your question by actually reiterating kind of a series of conversations that I've had with one of my daughters in the last couple of weeks, a lot. And the conversation really has just been, around like, hey, what do you do when you're not motivated? Like what like, and kind of the natural thing to do is, nothing. I mean, that, like the natural or all kind of human behavior's propensity is if you're motivated, you're doing something. And if you're not motivated to do something, then you don't do it. And you do whatever you're then motivated to do, which might be sitting on the couch or watching Netflix or messing around on Facebook or, maybe whatever it is. And so my first answer and what gets me motivated, there's sometimes it's, like a vision around what we're doing with ending single-use plastic water bottles and democratizing water and decentralizing water. There's other days where it's responsibility and obligation. And I think for me, at least, part of the magic, and I think this is true for really ultimately people that are successful in life. And I don't necessarily just mean that to be a metaphor or kind of a direct parallel to just being financially successful. I mean, in the scheme of things, that really is quite irrelevant. But in terms of being successful in life, ends up doing the things that you need to do. It ends up being doing the things that you need to do oftentimes when you don't really want to do them. And I think that is a lot about waking up early in the morning. I mean, and I like waking up early in the morning. I like getting up at like 4, 5, 6 o'clock. It's pretty natural for me anymore. It didn't used to be, but habits can be formed. But there's a lot of days I do the things that I do, not because I want or am motivated to do them, because I feel a responsibility to do them. That responsibility in this sense ends up being, and for me, it's different than what it is for a listener. But I mean, we all have similar threads, which is an obligation or a responsibility to, family or friends or a spiritual life or a mission in their job life or employees or investors, or it's a combination of all of those things. So, my answer might be actually a little bit atypical from what you might have thought I would started with, which really ends up being kind of the more typical, hey, this is really around a vision. But a lot of times it's also around commitment and responsibility and doing what you need to do, even when you don't feel like you need to do it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. It's a good motivational speech. I like it.
Well, yeah. Maybe it worked better for you than it did my daughter. I'm still working on that piece being inspirational and transacting and turning into activity with my daughter. But it's a hard time we're in too, of course, right? I mean, This is, when you think about, I mean, I've talked to numerous adults. We're all struggling with the same thing, which is, hey, it's fine to go in lockdown for 6 weeks, but now 6 months and then 9 months. And then is this thing ever going to end? The latest article I read this morning is, hey, this doesn't end. This is just a constant mutation. And what does that mean for life? And, so I think this topic of motivation is actually a really, really good one, because we're all struggling with it.
Oh, man.
And, people that have kind of never really even quote unquote really struggled with it are struggling with it. So we're all in the same boat on this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. My wife and I were just talking about how just about probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, I started getting not me and her both, just irritable and just grumpy, and just took us a couple of weeks to realize that the pandy's finally gotten to us.
Yeah.
But it's definitely all encompassing, right? Like every human being that's on this planet is dealing with it pretty much.
I didn't know Canadians could become irritable. I mean, I used to work with a lot of Canadians, so I'm learning. I still don't quite believe it, but
yeah, there's a lot of sorries involved with the irritability.
Yeah. Yeah, very politely irritable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, disagreeing,
the best kind.
Yeah, that's right. So continuing on with that kind of motivational speech, and so I'll be honest with you, like I've never spoken with somebody in the podcast that is like a CEO of a for-profit company that's trying to do this. Or actually, that's not true. I spoke to Diego from Pachama, who I'm not sure if you know Pachama, but they're a carbon capture company. But anyways, I've never spoken with somebody that's like selling a product the way that like that FloWater is, right? And so I was trying to find a way to discuss this that wasn't, because there's this thought in our society, right, that like all things corporate and all things industry is gross and pushy and buy this thing, you know what I mean? And I was trying to stay away from that and stay towards the concept and the science and the motivation and the reason behind it, right? And I think that in itself is, because I think what you're doing is great, and we'll get into that. We'll have to explain that because I haven't done that yet. But so I wanted to talk a little bit about your background. Like you have a business background, and what was it about this concept, the FloWater concept? So democratizing water and all that kind of stuff that attracted you, right? Like you have the business skill set, and we need that. How did you decide to apply it here? What was the motivation, right? What was the driver?
Yeah, I think there are three kind of buckets to this, and none of them really were just one big aha epiphany for me. I think, like with most things in our lives, sometimes we have this moment of truth where it kind of all comes together. You're in the shower, you're on a walk, you're having a conversation, you're driving somewhere, and then suddenly like it all kind of intersects and then the light bulb goes off. But the reality is that kind of quote unquote light bulb going off really is most often a function of 10, 30, 50, hundreds of other intersecting points that happen maybe days, weeks, years, decades before, that have kind of all swirled and culminated to intersect at one point in time. And so it's kind of an overall theme I also have for my life, which is like there's never like kind of one big thing. It ends up being 10,000 things, and you do more of them right than wrong, even though you can get some big breaks or bad fortune along the way. Yeah. So going back to your question specifically, I think there were a multitude of things that led up to it. I mean, on one hand, I can look back 20 some years ago when I started my career in Fortune 500 pharmaceutical companies. And I was, for years, I worked in corporate marketing at Eli Lilly in Indianapolis. And this is not the impetus to FloWater, but this is like just one example of something that kind of started to set the stage and started to kind of gnaw at me and caused me to change some of the things in my personal life or my vocation. And, one of those became, as much as I love for-profit, as much as I appreciate the value of pharmaceutical companies, as much as, as a personal recipient and, being years ago, having dealt with a pretty serious MRSA infection and being hospitalized and being like super grateful for highly potent antibiotics that were made by pharmaceutical companies. At the same time, I also became disillusioned to a degree where, the whole adage is like, if you're a hammer, you think everything is a nail, and just wanting to treat everything with pharmacological therapy. And it just became discouraging to me because there's a middle ground. I think, this probably even ties and sets up a discussion around profit and for-profit and nonprofit and advocacy and mission-driven organizations and a variety of philanthropic efforts that people are doing and how they can kind of work together in a healthy way, and sometimes how they don't work together in such a healthy way. And I think pharmacological therapy is a really good example of that, which is, in certain cases, it's life-saving and life-changing. In other cases, it's life-destroying, and it really depends on how you use it. And so I kind of started to move my career and I kind of did it intentionally. I kind of fell into it. It was a combination of both, but started to really move it into things that were more around prevention and wellness, nutritional products or supplements and, things that will be more preventive on the spectrum rather than treatment. And then that kind of like dovetails into, and that kind of spans a period of zigzagging over 20 years to kind of get to where I am today. Cause there's for most of us, there's not much of a straight linear line to where we are today from where we started 2, 3, 5, 10, 20 years ago. And that really came down to, one was this was a big opportunity. It was a big opportunity to do good while doing well. Number two, we have a huge plastic issue in the world, not just in the United States, but we have a huge issue. United States is a huge propagator of this single-use plastic water bottle issue. I mean, it's kind of the most extreme. The single-use plastic water bottles is kind of the most extreme waste of plastics and misuse of plastics in the majority of cases, but many other countries and then many other products. So uncycling, this idea of uncycling rather than, what big bottled water has tried to kind of greenwash into just recycling, which nobody
I love
does.
that term, by the way, big bottled water. It's just like,
it's like big tobacco in the 60s is really where I pulled it from. So like there's this great, there's
Big
this great
Pharma,
movie.
that,
There's this great movie called The Insider, I think. I think Russell Crowe is in it. And it was about big tobacco in the 60s. And I think in many ways, big bottled water is very much kind of the big tobacco of 2020 and 2021 or the 2020s. And so ultimately, that second piece of it ends up being uncycling and, removing plastics from the ecosystem, not just making a lot of plastics and then trying to recycle a pittance of them. And that's what ends up happening. The reality is, like, everyone can talk about how good recycling is. Yes, we should all do it. The reality is nobody does it for the most part. I mean, recycling is over 20 years. There have been huge efforts and advocacy applied to recycling, and less than 25% of the US population, and even in San Francisco, less than 25% of the population recycles. Now, your listeners are probably well within that top 5% of like recycling, composting, and that's fantastic. Like more people should do that. But the way to really change it is, hey, let's keep these plastics from even being created in the first place, so we don't have to recycle them. Like that's the solution. I mean, if we have to use plastics in certain instances, of course, recycle. But if we don't have to use the plastics in the first place, well, the solution really is like, don't smoke. Not just go from smoking Marlboro Reds to Marlboro Lights.
Right.
So, and then the third one really was a wellness initiative. When I mentioned I have two daughters that are 18 and one turns 19 this Saturday. And when this was started, they were like 9 and 10, 8 and 10, 9 and 10. And I remember going to these soccer games and, I'd take them to soccer, and after the games, they'd be getting like Dr. Peppers and Snickers bars. And this is when I lived in Silicon Valley. I still live in Silicon Valley part-time, but this is when I lived in Silicon Valley. So, I mean, this is not like where I grew up in the heartland of Ohio, where like you can kind of subsist on Twinkies and Swiss Miss rolls and Red Bulls. And I'm not, and I'm kind of generalizing myself. I mean, there is a degree of truth, which is that, in certain environments, there are just certain behaviors that are healthier that have been applied a little bit earlier. And that's getting equalized, thankfully. But my point is, I was still going to these soccer games in Silicon Valley, and my kids are getting fed like absolute crap after a soccer game. And I went through a period of time in my life where I was pretty athletic in college and played football. And then I got pretty unathletic and pretty heavy after college because I kept eating like I was playing football, but I wasn't,
right.
I was just sitting at desks and taking people out to dinner a lot. And I kind of realized, 80% of it is nutrition. And that's where it really was an epiphany for me also with my daughters, taking them, like looking at the programmatic behaviors of what we do with our kids. I mean, I literally look at sugary carbonated beverages. I mean, it's like, this is going to sound very extreme, but I mean, it's a little bit like legalized cocaine for kids, which is if you look at what happens to certain parts of neural pathways in your brain and what gets lit up as a result of stimulating it with sugar. And then you look at what happens with type 2 diabetes and, metabolic syndrome and, ADHD and all the contributing factors to that. It's a really horrible set of behaviors. Look, I love Dr. Pepper. I drink one a year on Thanksgiving. It's like a ritual for me. I do not miss it, but that's it. Like I have one a year. That's it, and so you start having one a day and that's a problem. And so that really became oriented around how do we get kids to fall in love with water again? Like how do we 70% of Americans, 80% of citizens globally are chronically dehydrated. Like, what would the world look like with obesity, ADHD, skin elasticity, just aesthetics? Like, if we just want to get on the vanity side of it, just looking better, what would the world look like if we just hydrated and didn't pollute the environments with plastic? So that's a little bit of a story as to kind of what led me down the path. But that was kind of the circuitous path. It wasn't a very linear path.
Right. Oh no, I think that's pretty standard, right? Like there's not too many people that have that Hollywood moment where it just kind of, aha, that's what I need to do with my life. Like, no, it's a long path, right? You pick a road, you go down it and you follow it till you change paths. So yeah. No, very cool. So, I guess we should jump on to the plastic situation. Like I was saying before, like I don't know anything about, like I know the general like headlines and stuff that you see in newspapers and online newspapers, as if I read newspapers. I forgot about that. You know what I mean? Like online, social media, whatever, right? Plastics in the ocean, plastics are bad, people aren't recycling, all this kind of stuff. Can you just quickly paint a picture of the issue that we have with specifically with like plastic water bottles, because that's what we're talking about here. What is going on? What is the problem, and how come recycling isn't working?
Yeah, I think well, first of all, it's a great question, and it's a great setup to the synthesis of the problem. What we are trying to have a, significant hand, not the only hand, but a significant hand in solving for. And I think it really comes down to, like if I could kind of try to draw a visual around it, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, we didn't have the issue with plastics in our water. There was no plastics in our water. There were no plastics 100 years ago, and 50 years ago, plastics were just emerging. And they weren't in our food system. They weren't in our waterways, just in the same way that, Roundup in the 70s, which is a chemical, it's the branded chemical compound called glyphosate, which is used as the number one commercial agricultural crop product that's used worldwide. That was in the 70s when that started becoming in use, but that wasn't in our water and food because it takes years for it to finally dissipate and break down and travel through the soils and to tributaries and lakes and whatnot. And that's ultimately what's happened with plastic. And so let me give you the data point. Kind of the high level on it is, when you drink, there was a study done in New York several years ago. SUNY did a study, and they basically did a sampling of a lot of tap water and a lot of bottled water. So here's the data. The data shows that in over 90% of bottled water, when you pick up a bottled water in the store, pick your favorite brand. But when you pick up a bottled water in a store, over 90% of those bottles of water have over 300 pieces of microplastic that are sitting and floating in it that you're drinking with every liter. So you say, okay, well, that's bad, but okay, the smokers are the ones inhaling the smoke. So dumb of you to be drinking bottled water. Okay, well, that would be kind of okay. Still a problem to solve, but like one that we could say, well, hey, if we're not drinking bottled water, we're not affected by this. If that were the case, the problem is that this same SUNY study showed in a sampling of a lot of tap water samples that over 90% of tap water samples had the same number of over 300 microparticulates of plastic per liter of water. So the problem
is this is just in the States, or is this? I'm sure it's probably
this is in the States, but this is worldwide now. Like there was an article a couple years ago that it's like 18 months ago where they're now registering on Mount Everest. They are now identifying and capturing and registering microplastics that are in the air in the atmosphere.
Oh shit.
So like kind of the headline on this is like, there's two headlines. There's a metaphor and there's a headline, but the headline on it is, hey, whether you're drinking bottled water or not, you're now drinking bottled water. Like you are literally drinking your bottled water and ingesting these microplastics. And I think it's a lot like cigarettes, which is, one cigarette never killed anybody. 1,000, not so good. You smoke 10,000, like probably gonna not feel super great. You smoke hundreds of thousands, and suddenly that's where you start to see the material degenerative effects of 6,000 known chemicals in tobacco products. Bottled water actually contains 10,000 known chemicals to create that plastic bottle. One and a half times more than a cigarette. In terms of chemicals. And now we're literally drinking those in the form of microplastics because they don't dissolve. They just disintegrate and they're permeating our gut lining. And it's actually showing up in the placenta of pregnant moms and umbilical cords in newborn infants that have never even drank a bottle of water. And so I think that's the problem to solve for is, this is an issue and it's not going to get solved by it's not going to get solved by convention, and it's not going to get solved by big bottled water companies basically saying, hey, look at us. Like, we just reduced the size of our cap 30%. Like, we're super green. Or, reuse, recycle, quippy taglines on it when 25% of Americans at best recycle. And that's after decades of education and awareness around it. And so this leads us back to, well, we need to uncycle. We need to break the kind of problem down to the higher order level. And that higher order level is, well, how do we, because here's the other tieback that it's kind of funny from a human behavior perspective. If we lived in the middle of the desert, and there were no water sources, I think it would be a very tough problem to solve. We'd say, yeah, this is bad, but we need water. Like, and if it's not available in an aluminum container, or if it's not available in glass, and it's only available in single-use plastics, and there's no other water access, what else are we going to do? And that's a tougher problem to solve. Let's say there's no desal available, and you got to cart it in and truck it in. Well, okay, like, this is a very extreme example of a use case for single-use plastic water bottles that basically does not exist for the most part anywhere in the world. For the most part, there's some exceptions to that. However, here in the U.S., Canada, any what would be kind of classified a first world country, we're like 20 feet away from water at all times. Like, we don't have a problem called, if I could only find a faucet, I would need to buy a bottle of water. That's not the problem. The problem is consumers now, for good or for bad reason, it doesn't really matter. They have been trained to not like or not trust what comes out of the tap. And the solution is not, let's make, greener plastic PET bottles, unless you work for Big Bottled Water and you just are focused on making a ton of money through that vehicle, which is kind of goes back to my pharma days, which is, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. So of course, like, everyone should drink bottled water. Everyone should be taking Prozac, that has a bad day, sure. Right? It just ends up being like kind of endemic to how you are wired and what you're doing in your day job and how you make money, unfortunately. And oftentimes, not always, but often. And so, we look at this and we say, well, gosh, the solution for this is, like, how do we end this plastic problem? Well, let's get people to fall in love with tap water again. Tap water is, the fact that tap water is freely available or close to free. It's, minuscule cost compared to any other product that we pay for, including, in most cases, electricity. How do we get people to access the tap water that they have freely available to them in a hotel, school, gym, corporation, a retailer, in their manufacturing facility, in their distribution center, in their home? And that's what we're solving for, is we're basically building a new water platform, and we're building a new type of water where we're taking an existing water supply and then plugging in, or in some cases plumbing in, but plugging in a FloWater device that radically changes that tap water and turns it into clean, great tasting, plastic free drinking water that consumers can trust.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, that sounds great. It sounds like a good solution, right? So, but just before we move on, I do want to get to the kind of environmental impacts of the plastic water bottles and that kind of stuff, considering this is an environmental podcast, right? But just before we move on, I just want to briefly touch on the microplastics thing again, because like, it's one of those words that you hear all the time and it's everywhere, and so I want to know, is there information, has there been studies, has there been a long enough time where we've been exposed to this stuff where there's been like scientific evidence to point to the problem, like the health problems that this is creating? And you know what I mean? Because it's like saying, for example, like you mentioned the word chemicals, right? The word, like, saying there's lots of chemicals in something, to me is it can be misleading, right? Because water's a chemical, you know what I mean? So it's like there's lots of natural chemicals. So it's but if you're talking about, harmful chemicals, that's a different thing, right? Obviously, there's a distinction to be made, right? But I just want to be clear. Like, what can you point to say? Because it obviously sounds bad. We got plastic in our bodies. That sounds terrible. How can we? Is there any information you can provide to just point to people to be like, hey, if you're curious about the effects of microplastics, here's what you should go look at, and that kind of thing?
Well, I would say couple things. One is Plastic Pollution Coalition, ppc.org. Okay. I believe it's ppc.org, is a great source of a lot of articles and a lot of resources around the impact on plastics for both human health as well as environmental health, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be one, I think, terrific independent nonprofit resource of organization that has been highly committed to the cause around raising a level of consciousness and awareness to the destructive effects of plastic. And so there's a bunch of great reference data there. I mean, the reality is that microplastics, I mean, what microplastics do is they're a contributor to oxidative stress and inflammation, for example. There's a variety of data that, you know, and some of it is preclinical data, some of it is purely animal data, and others is kind of secondary retrospective data where, you know, it's very hard to kind of capture data because 10 years ago, this really wasn't known to be as big of a problem as it is clearly evidenced to be now today. I mean, today, this is a mega trend. It's a clear one. It's a huge problem. 10 years ago, it's much more of a fringe in many ways, right? And so, you know, there's not a lot of like prospective studies capturing patient populations and studying them for a period of 5-10 years, those who drank plastic bottled water and those who did not, or those who had a filter on their water and weren't ingesting microplastics. But one of the things you can do is look at, you know, regression studies and look at the impact and look at, you know, what, you know, microplastics do in a test tube or what it does in the human body or what it does in animal studies. And, you know, inflammation and oxidative stress are absolutely two of those. I think if you look at, you know, even some of the destruction as relates to marine life, I mean, if we're looking at, you know, some of the problems that are related to the health and the vibrancy of our environmental ecosystem and particularly in oceans and lakes and rivers, we're facing a situation today where there are going to be more plastics in the ocean by the year 2050 than there are fish. And this is a huge issue because the fish are eating and the aquatic life are eating these plastics or microplastics. And it's not only destructive, in many cases fatal over time to them, but it also then contaminates a food system. And I think, you know, the best basis that I ultimately have around let's remove plastics from the environment. And by the way, this is a good point on chemicals, which is like water is a chemical. I would on the chemical piece, I think maybe I have to go back to my data to see what the exact definition of the 6,000 known chemicals are in tobacco products versus 10,000 known chemicals in plastic products to be able to kind of like delineate a little bit further, you know, the negative health effects of it. But I mean, I think ultimately what we're supporting is a regression back to a positive natural state. I mean, I think it would be very hard to argue, you know, it ends up being one of these arguments too. And sometimes I have this, and I know I don't suggest you're arguing this with me, but I think one of the arguments is like, like, is plastic really that bad? And do we really know? And like, does it really kill you? You know, and I think we can look at things like cigarettes. We still have people, I mean, amidst a sea of data and evidence otherwise, that will still debate, you know, that the data around inhalation of tobacco smoke is inconclusive. And I think ultimately what we would say is, hey, there is nothing at all. There's nothing controversial about regressing to a more positive, organic, natural state of eating food and consuming water. And in doing that, what we can do is we can eliminate pollutants from entering our bodies, like chlorine. You know, chlorine is a necessary byproduct that municipal water sources usually put in tap water to transport it safely to a consumer household. It's critical. But, you know, you don't want high levels, but you certainly even don't want low levels of chlorine affecting your flora in your GI tract for prolonged periods of time, like namely, you know, months and years. And if you can remove that, that's a good thing. And so the way that we look at this ends up being really a pretty simple fundamental is like, let's regress to a positive state where there are no pollutants or the removal of pollutants and infectants or potential infectants into our food and water. And then also ultimately, let's find ways to democratize, kind of so to speak. And it might be a little bit of a buzzword that, you know, maybe, you know, the kind of the nonprofit sector and the advocacy sector might cringe at that. But the reality is we do believe everyone deserves access to clean drinking water that they can trust. And one of the ways to do that most efficiently is get them something that they can tap into their water line at home so that when they turn it on, it's free of pharmaceuticals, it's free of lead, it's free of viruses and bacteria and chlorine and, potentially fluoride, depending. And that,
well, yeah,
that
like any toxicologist will tell you, right? Like the poison's in the dosage, right? So it's all about, the amount that you get. So no, it totally makes sense. Like, yeah, there's a level of chlorine you don't want in your body. Like I think it's fair to say that there's a level of plastics you probably don't want in your body. Like I'm not suggesting that, I was more, my question more came out of like, there's been a lot of industry around water, right? And clean water and, ionized water and oxygenated water and magnetically filtered water. And there's been a lot of pseudoscience around water, right? And what people need and like
vortexing water. Yes. Yeah. Like I know yes.
All that stuff. So I think there's a bit of uncomfortability with people when a new product comes out saying like, yeah, we got the clean, healthy water, deionized and it's alkaline, neutral and blah, 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 whatever, right? Like there's a bunch of bullshit is what I'm saying. And I think it's good to point out the difference in like the facts and just so people can feel comfortable and know that, okay, this isn't like some kind of hippie voodoo that's trying to convince me to buy their product, right? It's something that's backed by science. And this is like, hey, let's just have clean water again. Like that makes sense. Yeah.
I love that you brought that up because, one of the things that, I do find really frustrating is trying to drive a mission-based movement around something that we think is, we're convinced is the world's best tasting and best hydrating water, but it's also kind of in its most close to natural state. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have, like there's some components that, someone might say, oh, this like sounds kind of sexy, like, mm-hmm. Adding electrolytes back into your water. But the reality is like kind of all a FloWater system is doing is adding some of the same minerals that you would get through a natural soil filtering process, mm-hmm. that existed thousands of years ago, which is we're just remineralizing the water with things that are kind of essential to taste as well as bioavailability. And then when you come across these things that are like kind of catchy sounding and buzzworthy, it's almost like I have to turn this into like a present day stock discussion, but it's almost like GameStop, right?
Right.
Everyone, there's like a lot of legitimate. This is an interesting phenomenon that we're all watching right now. So I'm not like advocating either side of the equation. What I am just saying is GameStop is taking a lot of noise away from really good, and not us either. We're not a publicly held company. And so but a lot of other companies that are doing a lot of really good work in generating profits and doing good work and launching great products. The chaos of the story is getting kind of a short-term disproportionate voice. And then there'll be another story down the road. And so I think when I hear things like vortexing water, and things that I think are, or, like there's, I won't say the name of the company, but there's this water company out of Japan that uses these alkalizing plates. The water passes through these magical plates and it cures cancer. Basically, and 50 other things, right?
Classic.
I have two perspectives on that. One is I think that is absolute, complete and utter bullcrap and it's bogus marketing. I also have another perspective though, which is when I run into somebody that has one of those devices and they love it and they're drinking a ton of water, I never tell them my perspective. Even if they ask me, I'm like, hey, do you like it? They're like, I love it. And I'm like, man, I think if you love it and you're drinking a lot of water, like the placebo effect is real. If you think, it's good for you and if it's causing you to drink more water, then you know what? Go for it. Cause this is like one of the first categories where I can look at it and say, hey, this is pretty non-controversial, which is if you're drinking more water, I don't like how some of them are marketed. But at the end of the day, as consumers are fans of certain things, and if they've kind of latched onto it, what I really don't want to do is dissuade their interest in hydrating and drinking more water, though I do find the propaganda to be incredibly annoying because what it does is it discredits reputable companies around a cause, and it causes everyone to pause and question, like, I mean, this is the problem even in today. I mean, you look at politics, and not to make this about not to make this about politics either, but we're in an era now where nobody is sure of anything and no one trusts anything. Like kind of as a headline. And so,
for sure.
the more people that muck that up with artificiality and lies and deception, it is really irritating. And so I do really appreciate your asking about that, because, there's no magic bullet, other than kind of going back to in a way, kind of quote unquote, a regressive state of how things used to be in certain areas of our lives that were healthier.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a wise approach, I think. I too often take the approach of like, well, no, you should think what I think. So I try to avoid that.
Well, believe me,
it happens inevitably.
I do that plenty still too. But when it comes down to these alkaline water machines from Japan, I've given up on that one.
Yeah, for sure. But you have a point though, right? Like it helps them, and if it helps them drink more water and be healthier, then whatever, right? Like everyone's got their own way of doing this thing. So no, that makes sense. So I guess we should just talk quickly on maybe a little bit more on the like directly environmental impacts that this has had. Like maybe you want to talk a little bit about the stats of like how much plastic is going into the ocean, how much is in our parks and our stuff like that. Because I think that's something that people can directly relate to, right? And I mean, even relating it back to the Pacific garbage patch thing, which is something that is so ethereal and you hear about, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about. Like how much of this is like how is this happening? You know what I mean? Like how is there 90% of the world's water bottles are not being recycled and that kind of stuff? And like is it just consumer, I don't know, complacency or what?
I think well one is just kind of going big problem to how to solve it and why this problem still exists. There's 8 million tons of plastic bottles that get dumped into the waterways and seas every year. And
every year.
Yeah, I mean it's just an absolute insane amount. And again, I mean, going back to an earlier stat, by the year 2050, there's going to be more plastic than there are fish in all the oceans and lakes and rivers. And so, we have this big issue that never existed before, and that's a result of a lot of people just using a single-use PET bottle. They go to the store, fill it up, throw it away, right? They don't recycle it. And so then it kind of comes down to like, well, why don't people recycle? I mean, why, especially for your listeners, it probably is like in your audience, it probably is a very kind of unconscionable thing. It's like, well, you wouldn't, like, you take out your trash, like you don't just throw your dinner trash in the corner of the living room and just like let it pile up. Like you take that out. Why can't you just put your plastic in the blue bin and bring that out? Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think there's a variety of reasons around it. One issue, without getting too complicated into this, is there's a lot of data that even the stuff that makes it into your recycle bin, there's a pretty low chance that it actually makes it all the way through the recycling system.
What's that about? That's kind of what I've been hearing, right? Like in Edmonton, we're supposed to have this world-class recycling facility, and I'm hearing that all our friggin' recycling is ending up in the ocean somehow.
It is. I don't get it. I mean, this is where like the amount of leakage, and I think it comes down to this is a human behavior that is almost impossible to break until you switch to a new and a better way, right? Which is, if you look at it from a consumer perspective, it's like, taking out another bin every week sounds so simple, but when you're talking about changing a behavior that's been embedded in someone's life for many years, and maybe they don't recycle on the right day, or maybe they don't have a big recycling bin, and then like maybe they're ending up using the recycling bin because their trash bin is too small, and then they're just throwing both like sets of trash and crap into two different bins. But I mean, it ends up being, it's almost, it's like the irony of why do the majority of people not lose weight, that want to lose weight? If you look at the people that are obese and you could kind of take so many subsegments of problems in this world, whether that is drug addiction or obesity or, I don't know, divorce, maybe. It's like human behavior is a real pain in the ass because we're all really broken and flawed, and it's hard to change human behavior. It's really hard, right? And I think plastics and recycling are kind of just like such a really great example of, hey, it's so simple, it's so inexpensive, if there's any expense to it at all, so good for the environment, so hard to do en masse, so hard to get people to do. And so, that we go back to just tying to, well, how do we change the behavior? Because there's been a lot of nonprofits. I mean, and in fact, this might tap a little bit into some of the earlier comments you kind of alluded to around even like having a for-profit kind of guy, on the podcast here, when probably many are nonprofits and advocacy and trade groups. And then I understand a lot of it is probably around forestation as well. But, when I look at what we need to do, some of it has simply just not been done despite valiant efforts and great work in the nonprofit sector. And so I'll give you an example. There was, for many years in the US, a whole campaign around Take Back the Tap, which was take back your tap water, start drinking tap water again. And as a result of doing that, we're not going to be buying and wasting and, putting all this cash into big bottled water that then ends up crapping on the environment and like creating this negative, vicious cycle. And it was a really great message and not wildly successful. And why was it not wildly successful? The reason it's not wildly successful is because consumers really don't like or they don't trust their tap water. Like that's the issue. So trying to get them to go back to do it, it's a little bit like somebody that hates broccoli. Well, if they hate broccoli, my chances are better to try to like convert them. Like if broccoli is the gateway to being vegan and you have to love broccoli and you hate broccoli, you're never going to become vegan. Like you're just, that's not going to happen. But like if I can introduce you to a world of like plant-based eating and it starts with Brussels sprouts that are like fried with balsamic vinegar and that's like amazing to you, well then that's great. That's a great gateway into, well, how do I move to a plant adapted diet that, is less reliant on animal byproducts. And so I look at water the same way, which is education is really, really critical. But if all we're doing is educating people to try to drive them back to the solution, but the solution they don't like or they don't trust, in the US, 70 to 80% of Americans either do not like or don't trust their tap water. They don't like it because it's got chlorine in it, or it tastes bad, or it smells bad, or they think it smells bad, or they don't trust it, because 25 to 35% of randomized water stores that have been tested in the US over the last couple of years. This is a Popular Science article from like 3 years ago. I think it was 20% tested for higher than EPA allowable limits for lead in these random water sample tests done throughout the US. So a lot of consumers don't trust chromium 6 is another example of that. And so we can look at it and saying, hey, that's the right message 100%. To go back to the tap, go back and fall in love with tap water again. But then we look at it and we say, well, we got to do something to that tap water. Like we got to do something that kind of modifies it and takes sometimes what's coming in that's good, but turns it into something that's great that consumers prefer to bottled water. If we all had a natural mineral spring in our backyard, like we wouldn't have a business. Like that would be that's the ideal scenario. So like that's kind of what we're trying to really recreate in someone's house is close as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love it. It's a great idea, right? Because you're just removing that. You don't need these extra inputs of plastic when the water's right there. You just need to make it taste the way people want it to taste and to be healthy and good and not have chlorine or whatever else. Because even in Edmonton, like we have really, really high quality water, right? But even in the springtime, like they do infuse it with some chlorine to get rid of beaver fever and stuff, right? And you can taste that doesn't taste good. You can taste a little bit of it, right? And so, I'm totally on board with the idea. So explain what FloWater is exactly and like how that differs from ideas like, and I want to know actually, like, I couldn't really find answers to this, was the like Brita filters and that kind of thing, right? Like what's the difference? And just let's do your spiel. You only got a couple minutes left, so.
Sure. So, FloWater's a team of, 50, it's roughly 50 employees, that are situated in our headquarters in Denver, as well as throughout the rest of the United States. About half of them are in Denver. Started roughly 8 years ago in Silicon Valley and kind of incubated it out of Silicon Valley, but have been in Denver for most of the last 5 years. And the focus of our entire company is to put an end to single-use plastic water bottles and radically change the way that consumers drink and consume water, and in doing so, really dismantle incumbent infrastructure, right? Transportation of water, all of the waste, all the CO2 byproduct, all of the storage and all the manufacturing that goes into plastic bottles, and all the degradation of the plastic bottles that end up in the environment. And so by really dismantling, ultimately with the goal of dismantling an entire category, and it's very much a David and Goliath story of trying to take down, big bottled water. And we might end up doing it with someone as a partner. And the big, I'm not completely anti big bottled water companies. I'm anti what they're doing with single use PET, but they could be, and some of them will emerge to be, a really positive force for good and a force for change, just in the same way that CVS, one of the world's largest drugstores, stopped selling cigarettes years ago because it was the wrong thing to do as a drugstore, right? And they're going to start to move their model into something in a way better. And so our focus really is on recreating the world of tap water by delivering the world's best tasting water to wherever consumers work, rest, and play. And kind of embedded in that is, a little bit of, maybe some catchy terms, but it really is about democratizing water. Like, everyone deserves access to clean drinking water they can trust, whether it's in their home or in their school or, in their gym. And some people, have greater financial proclivity to pay for this than others. And the way to do this to the mass market is to leverage the existing water infrastructure, get something that is either at least adequate, if not good, and turn it into something fantastic. And that is really what we're trying to do, is we're building out a new water platform of how water is delivered, consumed, and enjoyed wherever consumers work, rest, and play. Some of the differences just from a product perspective, we have a variety of different products. We have a FloWater refill station that is primarily, right now it is absolutely exploding in schools. So we have a contactless, touchless refill station that plugs into basically any wall and can get installed and set up in roughly 30 minutes next to a water fountain. So these are exploding within schools now because kind of the conventional water fountain is dead, and a FloWater refill station. Yeah, it's like, it was gross before the pandemic, but can you imagine now with COVID, filling your bottle over a basin that someone's been dribbling over? It's like, you could not pay me enough money to do that right now. And so our business in schools and in replacing water fountains has been exploding, not only because we have a touchless option that, consumer can just walk up to, but also because we do things like we use activated oxygen, which is incredibly powerful at destroying viruses and bacteria. And that is pulsating throughout the FloWater refill station every 6 hours. And then we use a variety of 7 different filtration and purification devices, including some that remove up to 99.9% of viruses, bacteria, total dissolved solids, chromium, 6, lead, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, herbicides like glyphosate, et cetera. So the power of the product ends up being, you're getting something that is ultra purified bottled water on tap. And again, in schools is doing incredibly well. Hotels is doing incredibly well. And then what we've also done is we've kind of done a light version of that for the home. And there's a FloWater faucet filter that you can screw onto your faucet. And it is a 5-layer filter. It's not the same 7 layers as a FloWater refill station. One is kind of like the Tesla Model S, and the other is more like the Tesla Model 3, and it has some stuff that's modded down, or you just can't fit into a faucet filter. But it removes, for example, fluoride, microplastics, chlorine, a variety of other contaminants, and takes tap water and makes it really taste good. Taste good. And then we also have we're launching a FloWater ready to drink in an aluminum vessel, and this is kind of our way. This is going back to my tobacco analogy. It's kind of the best way to try to explain this to people is,
sure.
What we're doing is we're kind of launching with Nicorette, which is we're launching these, there's people that want to kind of migrate off of single use plastics, and moving to something like aluminum is far superior. Aluminum is infinitely recyclable. The recycling rates around aluminum are way higher than single use PET. And also it can just forever be recycled. I mean, it doesn't degrade with each recycling. And on top of that, what we're really trying to do is with a pre-filled FloWater, ready to drink aluminum vessel, have a premium product that's sold for the same price as other premium bottles of water. But we want we want to train that consumer to refill it 5, 10, 15 times. Because if you just take one multi-use bottle and refill it 10 times versus buying one single-use bottle and using it one time, we've just seen a 90% reduction in single-use plastic PET waste just by refilling it a few times, even if someone only did it 5 times. So part of what we're trying to do is just train people. Right now it's kind of the world of like, you buy a single-use PET bottle that gets thrown away, or you buy a $20, $30, $40 Hydro Flask or Swell or Mizu bottle. And that's not a very practical kind of on-the-go solution. Like if you're at a grocery store and you're going to the beach and, like you want something that if you lose it, you're not out $30. That's why people like single-use plastic water bottles, is they're good for on the go. And then like if you lose it or you dispose of it, it's not as big of a deal. We want it to be a big deal to dispose of it. And we want people to recycle it, but we also want people to refill it 4, 5, 7 times and kind of train them, so to speak, to get off this single-use PET crazy train and onto something that's tastes better and is better for the environment and is better for them.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I commend you. It's a really interesting product for sure. And I think everyone has to drink water, right? So it's good to have something like this that people can go to and they can research it and they can look on your website. What is it? drinkflowwater.com?
It is. Yep. www.drinkflowwater.com, 1W. And then on all the social media handles, it's at drinkflowwater.
Awesome.
And look forward to reconnecting with you down the road. Thanks for the opportunity to be on your podcast, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing and love the questions. Thanks for asking really great questions and not layups either. Like thanks for asking hard questions. I'm really grateful for it and I enjoy it.
Awesome. No, I really enjoyed this conversation and I appreciate all the information you're able to provide. This is really great. And, thanks for your time. I know you got to get going. So, we'll talk soon and I'll be in contact to let you know when this is coming out.
Fantastic. Matt, thanks a lot. Really pleasure.
Thanks a lot for listening, everyone. I hope you liked that. I know I learned a lot. Thanks, Raz, for coming on. I appreciate you taking the time. It was a great opportunity and I can't thank you enough. So, remember to rate and review, tell your friends about it, spread this thing around so everyone can know, and this thing will continue to grow. Thank you, everyone, for continuing to listen. I really appreciate your support, and I hope to continue to bring you cool conversations for the foreseeable future. So thanks a lot, guys. Take it easy, and we'll see you next time.